In the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, my son lifts a glass and calls himself my landlord. We took him in, while a forged rental agreement waits on his phone, and VA mail sits rerouted to his inbox. He laughs off 30 years of mortgage and service like a tab I owe. I lay down the deed, the notarized trust, and escrow receipt. I will not pay rent in my own house again. When family becomes the thief, how do you take your home back? My name is Robert Hale, 68, Army, retired Sergeant First Class, Signal Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, 2 Bronze Stars, a stack of campaign ribbons, a drawer of laminated cards that made sure my men got home when radios failed and satellite links choked. I live in the 3-bedroom house I bought at 31 when interest rates ate half my paycheck, and pride paid the rest. A square of brick and oak that I repaired with my own hands after storms and after years, installing the water heater by flashlight during a blackout and repaneling the den when the kids outgrew crayons and learned silence. I can solder cokes blindfolded and read a map by the way the paper resists the fold. My wife, Lydia, is gone 6 winters now. Cancer does not negotiate. I keep her mixing bowls lined in the cupboard like formation, and every Saturday I wipe the dust from her recipe cards because discipline looks like love when no one else is watching. I am steady, methodical, not quick to anger, not quick to surrender. I kept my body in range and my voice in check, and my name on the deed. I had 2 children under this roof, and my son stayed closest, close enough to lean on the fridge and say, "Dad, I've got you." When I retired, close enough to carry the ladder while I did the shingles, close enough to know where the safe is and how I set my passwords in patterns only someone raised at this table would guess. After Lydia's funeral, he slept on the couch because the quiet shook him, then moved into the spare room for a few weeks to help me sort the hospital bills, which meant lifting boxes while I read line items and called billing offices. Weeks turned into months, and I told myself family is a loop. You give and you get. You share the weight. He made dinners sometimes, and I convinced myself burnt rice is still rice when someone tries. He started handling household finances, which first meant carrying envelopes to the mailbox, and then meant opening them, and then meant routing them to his email because paper is a risk. And I agreed, because security had been my trade, and delegation is a kind of trust. When the VA called about an appointment, he put it in his calendar, and when the grocery store ran canned tomatoes on sale, he texted me a photo with a thumbs-up sticker. And when the furnace rattled, he called a buddy who knew a guy who did a tune-up cheap, and I paid the guy with cash from the coffee can above the microwave. I told myself this is what Lydia would have wanted. Our boy anchored, our boy useful, our boy steady in crisis. I did not clock when the ladder switch flipped and my hand did not hold the rail anymore. He began using phrases that grew teeth slowly. "We took you in," he'd joke at family barbecues, and people laughed because I smiled, and because a father with tongs in his hand does not drop them to correct a punchline. "We've been covering a lot," he'd say when he returned from the bank, placing receipts on the counter like returning from a hunt, and I would nod and put them in a drawer with manuals for appliances we no longer owned. When my pension hit each month, he logged the deposit and texted me a screenshot, a neat green arrow pointing up, and I thought, accountability is comfort. He reorganized the bills into a shared spreadsheet I didn't open because he explained it in a calm voice, and calm voices lower defenses. The first time he mentioned rent, it was a joke, the living room air wobbly with football noise, but the second time it was a line item, a dad's share, and the third time it was an amount, and I heard Lydia's voice in my ear saying, "Ask what share means," and I didn't because the game was in the 4th quarter and I wanted to see the kick. It's funny how a word can creep inside your coat and take the place of a lining. "Rent. The house is paid off," I said softly in my head, the way you tell yourself your name when a medic shines a light into your eyes. He answered the thought out loud, without my mouth moving. "Property taxes feel like rent," he said with a shrug. "Utilities feel like rent. Inflation feels like rent. Dad, you know." And I nodded because inflation does feel like rent, and because he gave a little speech at Thanksgiving about gratitude, and I didn't want to embarrass him. And because when he was 8, and broke my radio. He brought me screws with wet eyes and said, "I'm trying." And my brain kept him 8 for longer than is healthy for a man like me who knows better. When the daughter, my granddaughter, asked if she could help me bake Lydia's rolls, the boy, now a man, told her to set the table instead. And she looked at me, and I winked to say it's okay. Rhythm is smoother when we choose fewer hands, knowing that rhythm can hide a lot of things. I keep numbers like coordinates. Over 18 months, I transferred $38,600 labeled as household costs, and of that, $12,400 was supposedly my rent share, a monthly number that ratcheted from $300 to $850 in a year, with energy spikes and maintenance contingency noted in parentheses. I covered $6,800 in medical copays and prescriptions, mostly mine, though I noticed a heart medication I do not take past through 1 month, and told myself maybe the pharmacy miscoded. I forgot to circle back. Groceries averaged $480 a month, and I started buying bulk rice and beans like I was prepping for a storm because the numbers steadied my breathing. Electric bills jumped from $96 to $212, then settled, then spiked again in months when the son said he had friends visiting and everyone is family here, and I nodded. And then I replaced a breaker myself at dawn, because the trip pattern felt wrong. Property taxes came due, and he suggested we split them, like rent, and I heard my own laugh come out flat. But I wrote a check for $1,250 and told myself this is teamwork. My pension is $2,140 monthly. Disability, $1,020. Social Security, $1,300. On paper, I am fine. On paper, I have been better. The public insults found their footing in between bites. "We took him in when he got older," the son said at a neighbor's cookout, and a woman I didn't know touched my arm and called me brave, and I smiled and refilled the ice because deflection is a soft skill learned from casualty notifications and stubborn pride. He introduced his friends to my house as our place, and I didn't contest it because a word is cheaper than a fight. He posted a photo of the living room with a caption, "Homeowner grind," and I double-tapped by accident and then left it alone. Because arguing with a caption was a new form of war I wasn't trained for. He said, "We pay the mortgage," and I looked at the framed deed and made a mental note to put it somewhere safer. Then went to the garage to oil the squeaky hinge on the garden door instead, because I fix what I can touch. When the VA scheduled a benefits review, he insisted on coming and spoke for me like a translator, and the counselor looked at me over his shoulder the way a medic checks for pulse, and I met her eyes and smiled to say, "I am here. I am present." I know the difference between help and handling, and I watched my own smile and wondered when I stopped using my voice first. The breaking point arrived without sirens. On a Tuesday, when the mail felt thicker than usual, I found a benefits letter folded twice in a plain envelope tucked inside a stack of coupons and an invitation addressed to current resident. The letter thanked me for updating my mailing address to my son's email and listed that future notices would be delivered electronically. It referenced an online portal I had never logged into. I sat at the kitchen table, the one I sanded down after Lydia dropped nail polish on it in 1998, and lined up the letter with the edge of the wood until the margins agreed. That's my calibration ritual. I checked the envelope. The postmark was 3 weeks old, held somewhere, then slid to me when convenient, and I felt a gear shift in my chest. Calm, not cold. The way I felt when a convoy route changed at the last minute, and the map no longer matched the ground. A new variable. I set the letter down and requested a password reset through the VA site, and the confirmation email pinged on my phone, not his, and I realized he had set it to forward to a folder I couldn't see. And I changed everything while I watched the microwave clock mock me with 2:17. At 2:23, he walked in with fast food and said, "You're welcome," without context. And I nodded and put the letter in my breast pocket because paper near the heart is harder to steal. At 4:10, I opened the safe and pulled the deed, the notarized copy with 2 signatures that are mine and Lydia's in ink, the notary's stamp still crisp, and I took a photo and emailed it to myself with the subject line, baseline. Then I called the county recorder's office and asked for a title search. Polite, conversational, the way you ask how someone's weekend was before you test the fence. The clerk confirmed the title stood unchanged, and I logged her name and the timestamp. I have learned to keep an audit trail when the story in the house drifts from the story on the books. At 5:02, I noticed the shared spreadsheet had a new tab labeled Dad Rent Adjustment, and the number up top had climbed again, $950 now, with a note, Market Rates. In my own home, I poured coffee into the chipped mug Lydia bought at a yard sale because she liked how the handle fit her thumb, and I stared at the steam until it didn't look like anyone's breath anymore. Mistake. Noted. He framed it that evening as a normal update. He said, "Utilities are brutal. We've got to be fair." And I said, "Fair is a two-way lane." And he pivoted to a story about a friend who got evicted because the landlord needed to sell. And he let the story hover like a hawk above a field until I felt the shadow on my kitchen floor. He added, "You're not invincible, Dad." And I remembered the day he failed his driver's test the first time and smashed the steering wheel with his palm, then looked up at me, expecting rescue, and I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Drive again." And he did, because he trusted that I would not let him crash even when learning means scrapes. I watched him now and saw a man who had learned that pushing gets results when the person opposite you is more interested in peace than winning. That's on me. Accountability is a better teacher than blame. I went to the garage and pulled the file box Lydia labeled House Core, a box I hadn't opened since the last refinance check cleared a decade ago. I laid out documents on the workbench, purchase agreement, refinance note with paid stamp, tax receipts, the last pest inspection report, the surveyor's map with a neat rectangle, and the big oak sketched like a friendly cloud. I took photos of each on my phone and uploaded them to a new folder with a name I would remember, even if someone changed my device. 1979 present house spine, because a spine holds you upright when a punch lands. I drove to the bank night drop with a deposit of a $500 cashier's check. I found folded behind the deed Lydia's emergency fund money, she'd called it, and I wrote the memo, buffer. On the way home, I stopped at the post office and rented a P.O. because the clerk had a slow hour, and because the habit of routing comms through secure channels is a reflex I never lost, and I stood on the sidewalk outside and listened for the sound of my own keys in my pocket, like a metronome. Inventory complete, I thought. New route. The next morning, I told my granddaughter to come by after school if she could spare a half hour, to help me with numbers, and she nodded in that serious way older teenagers do when they recognize that a game has started and they might play a position. I did not tell her everything. I handed her the electric bills and asked her to graph the usage line on paper, and she used a ruler with little sunflowers and wrote the months neat and small, and the spikes aligned with weekends her father had the guys over. She traced her finger along one spike and said, "Space heaters?" And I said, "Or doors left open." And she said, "Or gaming rigs." Grandpa, and I shrugged and made a note to check outlets for heat marks. The boy came home and saw her at the table and smiled too wide and said, "What's this, a committee?" And I said, "A review, because labels can be a shield." He put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Don't worry about this stuff." And she looked at my hand, steady on the table, and decided which one to trust without making a speech. Useful intelligence has few words. I called my doctor and confirmed my prescriptions. There was the heart medication again, not mine, and the nurse corrected it and suggested a new PIN for the pharmacy account. I changed the PIN and then changed the bank password and then set up two-factor authentication to my payback box notification app, a loop he could not intercept unless he broke laws bigger than the ones he played with at the kitchen table. I logged into the VA portal and found 3 messages archived in a folder called Handled, all marked opened at times when I was mowing the lawn or at the hardware store. And I printed each and put them in a red folder labeled Misrouted. I called the benefits hotline, and the hold music was a pattern I recognized from a day last year when my son sat in the living room with the TV at low volume, radio static covering the melody of bureaucracy, and I realized he had mastered the art of sounding attentive while rerouting the signal. Pattern confirmed. Risk documented. He tried to move the conversation to gratitude. "After all we did while you were deployed," he said, listing nothing and implying everything. And he shook his head like someone carrying a box invisible to anyone without the right guilt filter. And I let him speak until the sentence ended on its own breath. I rinsed a plate and set it in the rack, and dried my hands with the towel Lydia embroidered with green thread, a little crooked leaf that always made her laugh. And I said, "We're going to put everything in writing," and he smiled as if relieved. And I watched the relief and filed it where I file things that will be useful when the temperature changes. He does not know that writing is not his weapon alone. The point where tactician awakens is less a trumpet and more a radio click. I decided, in the quiet, to count everything, to root everything, to move without announcing movement. I ordered a new fireproof safe for documents and placed it in the hall closet behind a box of winter hats. I kept the old safe in the bedroom, obvious, with decoy papers inside, an old cable bill, an expired insurance card, a photocopy of the deed with the notary seal cropped off. I called a real estate agent under the pretext of a market assessment for insurance purposes. And she walked through the house, making notes about square footage and recent upgrades, and the way oak floors speak when sanded right. And I watched my son watch her, and pretend not to watch her. The way a man feigns boredom with a chessboard he can't read. I asked the agent for a preliminary contract, just to know the format, and she sent me a template with blanks I could fill with numbers later, and I printed it and slid it into the red folder. I kept my face neutral and said, "Insurance companies like documentation," and she nodded. And my granddaughter, who had asked to be looped in on anything numbers, sat quiet and scribbled in a notebook and looked at me at odd times, and I saw in her the shape of Lydia's patience. I did not announce the decision. I packed it in layers. I changed the Wi-Fi password and texted it to the family group chat as if the provider forced it, then logged devices and watched one unfamiliar MAC address pop up as guest, and I blocked it. And 2 hours later, my son asked why the TV in his room lost streaming, and I said, "Signal reset," and he shrugged and used his phone data, and I wrote TV on a list of assets purchased with whose card. I set a calendar note labeled inspection on a Saturday, and mentioned it out loud as if it were a termite visit, then invited my granddaughter to be there, and asked her to count outlets as a game. The son said he had plans that day, and rolled his eyes because I used the word inspection, and he walked away, humming like someone who won a round by not playing, and I let him think it. Control is a tide. You do not announce you can read the moon. Here is what tipped it from bothersome to intolerable. A message in my email. A copy of a forwarded rental agreement, drafted by my son, and signed by him alone, with my name typed at the top like a prop, an attachment name, Dad Agreement via BDF, and a timestamp 2 days earlier at 11:42 Mao. A time when I was asleep, and the house was quiet except for the hum of a refrigerator older than his first broken bicycle. He had attached that document to an email to a friend that read, "Got him on paper now. Less drama." And the friend replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a joke about boomer rent control, and I tasted metal in my mouth and put my hand on the counter until the room steadied. I printed the PDF, circled the date, and slid it into the red folder under the deed. I did not confront him. I did what I have always done best. I started the clock on a clean operation. I laid out a timeline with boxes and arrows. Day 1, secure all channels, mail, online accounts, pharmacy, VA, bank. Day 2, inventory, deed, tax receipts, insurance, maintenance records, photo log of every room with a timestamp embedded. Day 3, consultation, lawyer for a trust, agent for a preliminary market read, bank for a safe deposit box. Day 4, quiet test, pause one transfer, observe response, freeze a shared payment app, watch his phone habits. Day 5, assemble allies, a granddaughter who can read numbers, and a neighbor who nods more than he speaks, but knows property lines and people. I wrote contingency notes. If he escalates to public shaming, I document. If he threatens eviction from my own house, I call the police not to arrest, but to log. If he attempts to refinance, I put a fraud alert on my credit, and his assistance becomes evidence of intent. I wrote success metrics like a training exercise. Regain control of all mail. No unapproved charges for 30 days. Documented chain of custody for every critical document. Separate accounts prepared for immediate move if necessary. I closed the notebook and slid it under the bottom shelf of the pantry behind bags of flour. He hates cooking. He never checks flour. At dinner, I washed the plates while he spoke about a new arrangement where I would contribute a flat $1,000 monthly to household. And I said I would consider it. And he said, "Consider quick." And I nodded and said I'd like the terms in writing. And he said, "Already done." And I said, "Send it." And he looked surprised, as if the rules of engagement had shifted. That night, I moved the decoy cable bill to the top of the safe and left the safe door slightly ajar. In the morning, the bill sat on the dresser, moved an inch left, the way a cat nudges a glass to test gravity. Mistake. Noted. I smiled while making coffee because a probe can be useful if you want to map the edges of someone's nerve. The next Sunday, I stood at the sink polishing my military medals until they shone sharp enough to catch the late sun. Because anger handled is a tool, and those medals have absorbed worse storms than this. On the TV, a real estate show murmured about hot markets and quick closes, and I let the word closing roll around the room like a penny on a table. I went to the garage, took my spare set of keys, the ones I keep taped under the shelf, and placed them in my left pocket, then dropped them into my right and back again, listening for the jingle like a slow heartbeat. And when my son asked what that sound was, I said, "Memory exercise," and he laughed. And my granddaughter looked at the keys and then at me, and then wrote something in her notebook. The neighbor waved from his driveway and said prices were crazy good if you were thinking of selling. And my son said too quickly, "We're not selling." And I said, "We're not deciding today." And I heard a new static in the room, the kind that precedes a weather change. I routed the VA mail to the payback box and printed the confirmation and placed it in the red folder. I met with a lawyer who specializes in elder law and trusts, and I arrived early and sat in the parking lot reading the preliminary sale contract template, noting where signatures go and how funds flow. And when the lawyer asked my goals, I said, "Control and clarity." And he nodded and said, "A trust with your granddaughter as trustee aligns with that." And he explained mechanics, and I asked precise questions, and he answered. And I wrote checklists, and we drafted documents I did not yet file. He asked if there was immediate danger. I said, "There is momentum." And he said, "Speed favors the calm." And I smiled because that is a language I speak. I walked out with a manila folder, whose weight was measurable in ounces and relief. I placed it under the spare tire in my trunk and drove home the long way to clear the habit of telling anyone where I am. Back at the house, my son slid another rent adjustment under my coffee mug as if it were a coaster, and I lifted the paper and read the new number without moving my face, and he said, "Just keeping it realistic." And I said, "Realistic is measurable," and he misheard that as passive acceptance because he has lived a long time with a father who prefers building to arguing. Later, when he left for errands, I opened the shared payment app and paused outgoing transfers with 3 taps and a password. He did not know. And I set alerts to my PO box app for any attempted changes. And I watched the sun slide down the neighbor's fence like a slow fuse. What I will do next will change the map he thinks he controls. But for now, I stand in the hallway and listen to the house breathe, the way a medic listens to ribs rise and fall, and knows if the next breath will be steady. The keys in my pocket sound louder in the evening, a sound that says, "Count your exits and rehearse your lines," not for theater, but for precision. The realtor's business card sits under a magnet on the fridge next to Lydia's recipe for rolls, and my granddaughter's graph of electric usage is taped discreetly inside the pantry door. The red folder is fat enough to be persuasive and thin enough to travel if travel becomes necessary. I haven't said the line out loud. The one that will draw a line straight through the ledger and into the air like a signature you can't erase. But I have it loaded behind my tongue, like a final command you give when the convoy reaches the bridge. The boy thinks we are still at the stage of adjustments and speeches. He has no idea the deed is already copied twice. The trust papers are drafted. The mail is off his grid. The VA knows my voice again. And the bank manager wrote her initials next to a note that says, "No third-party access without my face and my hand." He still tells people, "We took him in." And they nod because they don't know the coordinate. And I let him say it because a story that wrong lasts exactly as long as the paper under it allows. Tomorrow there is a holiday planning text thread with the family, and he will propose that we keep dinner here as always, and I will agree, and I will set the table with Lydia's plates and fold napkins like flags, tight triangles, because rituals keep a man from shaking when the moment arrives. The documents are ready. The speakerphone contact labeled Realtor, confirm. The bank statements printed with transactions highlighted like warning flares, and the registered letter to serve if necessary sits in the red folder with the stamp already pressed and the address written in my neat block letters. I hear the front door. The boy home. Shoes off. A pause. The scrape of a chair. The polite noises of someone who believes the ground under him is permanent. I turn off the kitchen light and let the hallway lamp hold the room in a warmer color. And I stand for a breath and let the plan settle into my bones. And I check my pocket for the keys and the red folder and the small square of paper where I wrote the line. I will say when the room needs a sentence that ends one chapter and starts the next. I am steady. I am ready. And for the first time in a long time, I know exactly what I will refuse to pay for ever again. I woke before the sun and set my kitchen like a field desk. Coffee at 2 o'clock. Pen at 11. Red folder front and center. Phone face down until I needed its light. I wrote rules at the top of the notebook and read them aloud, once like a promise. No yelling, no pleading, no threats, only paper, clocks, and signatures. I listed targets in order of dependency: mail, money, medicine, deed, and underlined medicine twice because dependency breeds leverage. I wrote my name in block letters like I used to stencil on crates and felt my breathing steady. I move like water. He expects fire. I built a small go bag for documents the way I packed a ruck. No souvenirs, only survival. 2 copies of the deed. Trust draft. Bank statements. The forged DAD Agreement V2 PDF. A list of account numbers printed in 12-point font. Spare reading glasses. A USB drive mirrored with scans. A yellow legal pad already containing dates and initials. I labeled the red folder Chain of Custody because words affect posture. I put a cheap prepaid phone in the inner pocket and loaded it with only 3 numbers: the lawyer, the realtor, the bank manager. If the primary line went loud, I'd still speak. I mapped the network on paper. Circles for people and arrows for influence. My son sat in the center only by habit. Power sat in the lines. Granddaughter. Numbers. Calm. Witness. Neighbor. Gossip vector. Price intel. Porch camera angled toward my driveway if I needed a timestamp. Bank manager. Patel. Policy. Documentation. Account flags. VA counselor. Reyes. Benefits portal. Identity verification. Official notes that outlive anyone's story. Lawyer. Klein. Trust mechanics. Elder law. Registered letters. Realtor. Jordan. Comps. Timelines. Language that turns wishes into escrow. I drew dashed lines to the son's friends who ate my food and used my power. I didn't need names, only patterns. Who benefits? Who repeats the script? I shifted to digital ground and treated it like a comms sweep. I pulled my credit reports and set fraud alerts with all 3 bureaus, then placed freezes that require my voice in a branch to thaw. I enrolled in USPS Informed Delivery, rerouting everything to the Paligo Oidu box with a daily image feed of what should arrive, and built a rule in my email that sends any forwarded VA message to a folder named Misrouted Evidence. I installed a password manager, generated random strings, and printed the recovery kit for the safe deposit box. A soft inquiry from an online lender dated last month blinked like a tripwire. I called, logged the rep's name, and placed a formal identity theft notation. I did a physical sweep next, slow and thorough. I counted keys, tagged them with colored bands, then swapped the front door cylinder for a new one I installed alone at dawn, leaving the old one in a bag labeled Return that I did not intend to return. I photographed every room, wide, then detail, with the phone timestamp visible on screen like a little clock signature. Drawers closed, drawers open, safe closed, safe open with decoys visible. I read the electric meter and wrote it down, then flipped the breaker to my son's room off and on to confirm which label was his. The boss was mismarked. Now it isn't. I placed my red folder in a new fireproof safe, tucked behind sweaters, and left the old safe slightly ajar with bait. I ran the vulnerabilities like a checklist. Financial. He rides the ambiguity of household and share, skimming through renaming and timing. Countermeasure is categorization, freezes, separated accounts, and receipts that speak. Reputational. We took him in has traction. Countermeasure is a counter story with dates, amounts, and title. Legal. Unauthorized mail routing and a forged agreement are not jokes. Countermeasure is logged notices, a trust, and if needed a police incident number to memorialize. Emotional. Guilt and nostalgia remain his best tools. Countermeasure is ritual and distance. Lydia's bowls washed on Saturday. Phone silence during declarations. They win if I shout. They lose if I write. I translated the map into a plan with time boxes. Objective 1. Regain sole custody of all channels, mail, bank, benefits, within 72 hours. Objective 2. Formalize ownership protection, revocable living trust naming my granddaughter as trustee, within 10 days. Objective 3. Pre-stage exit options, preliminary sale contract, deposit readiness, mover shortlist, without telegraphing intent. Contingencies. If he escalates by threatening eviction, call non-emergency police to log elder coercion and present deed. If he attempts to refinance, credit freeze already blocks, but I notify the clerk's office to flag title monitoring. Success metrics. 0 unapproved charges for 30 days. All notices routed to my control. A signed trust and a rehearsed script for the reveal. I executed, line by line. I opened a new checking account at the credit union across town, where no teller knows my son's smile, and set up direct deposit changes for pension, disability, and Social Security. The rep handed me a printout with expected switch dates. I wrote them on my calendar in pencil and built a buffer by leaving last month's rent, share, sitting idle in the old account, to watch who tries to touch it. I created a new email address just for institutions, clean as a new field, and changed contact info everywhere that matters. I reserved a small safe deposit box and slid the USB clone inside. Recorded the box number on the back of an old grocery list because ordinary camouflage beats clever every time. I tested his reaction with a controlled pause. I let the automatic transfer labeled Dad Rent Adjustment miss its day and waited. The text came at 4:12 p. Ma'am, did you forget? Late fees hurt us both. I looked at the word us and wrote it down. 5 minutes later, a second text. It's just what we agreed to, followed by a PDF I already archived with its forgery date circled. I did not answer. Silence exposes intention better than arguments. At 6:05 p., he asked across the room if everything was okay with the bank, and I smiled and said, "Everything's good," and he stared at my hands instead of my face. Probe complete. Nerve located. Mistake noted. I switched pharmacies to one near the credit union and set a new pickup PIN. I asked the old pharmacy for a printed history, received the pages with the erroneous heart medication attached, and underlined it in blue. I scheduled the trust signing with Klein for Tuesday at 0900 and booked the notary next door simultaneously, telling no one but my granddaughter, who folded the time into her school schedule without blinking. I met Jordan, the realtor, for a market check, and while she measured rooms, I asked a hypothetical about a 30-day close. She answered with confidence I could bottle, then handed me a preliminary contract. I tucked it into the red folder and later wrote a deposit number on a sticky note to remind myself that readiness calms fear. I kept my head clear by touching the work. I polished Lydia's bowls until I could read my intentions in them without flinching, then stood in the yard, clipping back the rose bush she loved until the thorns stopped snagging my sleeve. A short thought cut in. My son learned that a raised voice makes me choose quiet. That is a tactic, not a trait. I brewed tea at 9, switched my phone to Do Not Disturb, and wrote the line I will say when the room needs a clean horizon. We're ending the confusion tonight. I practiced it once at conversational volume, then not at all, because over-rehearsal turns truth into theater. The house settled, and the text thread pinged with Thanksgiving logistics, sides, chairs, who brings pie. I typed rolls and set the dough recipe card where Lydia used to place it, a small ceremony that resets my spine. At the same moment, my calendar reminder for inspection popped up for Saturday at 10, and I smiled at the word inspection, doing its quiet job. The front door opened. My son stood there with a folder and that careful smile that says he believes the ground is still his. "We should sign the rent agreement tonight," he said. Light voice, practiced inevitability. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on Lydia's green thread towel, picked up the red folder, and let the house hold its breath. I set the house like a forward operating base, not with sandbags, but with lists taped inside cabinet doors, and a red folder that lived by my elbow like a reliable sergeant. I wrote deployment window, 7 days, and under it, no speeches, only switches. I stood in the hallway and tested the rhythm. Jingle keys once, feel the weight, check the deadbolt, breathe. I moved through rooms, closing drawers with the same pressure I used to close weapons cases, firm, repeatable. On the counter, I placed 2 phones face down, mine and the prepaid, and set my watch to vibrate at 9-minute intervals to keep me from drifting. Across the hall, his door was open. A game stream murmured. I flipped the router, entered the new password, and watched one unauthorized device drop. A text arrived in under a minute. Internet weird. I wiped the counter dry and replied, "Reset. Back in 5. He sent a thumbs up. He thinks acknowledgements mean ownership. I let him believe it for one more day. I opened the old account and left a single transfer, scheduled, $25 to household supplies, to look cooperative while everything else went dark. I replaced the smoke alarm battery in the hallway at dawn and let the beep test mark the hour. He came out rubbing his eyes, asked if I was doing projects, and blinked at the red folder. Inventory, I said, a word bland enough to pass any checkpoint. He poured cereal and scrolled his phone, then looked up to say the realtor's card on the fridge. Felt dramatic. I nodded, put the card in the drawer with rubber bands, and wrote down the timestamp of his glance like it mattered. Because everything mattered now. Move. Wait. Measure the reaction. Move again. I started with money, because money is a habit before it's a number. At the credit union across town, the manager, Patel, walked me through the switch like a field medic changing an IV line. Steady hands. No rush. I enrolled my pension, disability, and Social Security to the new account, set alerts to the prepaid, and asked for a no third-party access without in-person verification notation. She added it, initialed the line, and slid the paper across the desk for my signature. I wrote neat inside the box and circled the date. I opened a high-yield savings and named it Repairs, then created an internal transfer rule that moves $300 every month on the 15th. Because planned maintenance beats emergencies, and because structure keeps me calm when people try to make noise, I left the old account intact to watch who touched it, then asked for a printout of every automatic debit in the last 6 months. Autopsy helps prevention, I said. She smiled like she knew. I froze my credit with all 3 bureaus, set fraud alerts, and wrote the confirmation codes in pencil on the back of a grocery list, then slid it into my wallet behind Lydia's faded library card. An online lender had pinged me last month at 2:08. Oh, Mel. I called, obtained the rep's name, and logged the call as identity theft warning, documented. I opened the shared payment app and toggled a security feature that required my face for transfers. I tested it with a $1 ping to my new account and watched it arrive. I changed insurance autopay to the credit union, set property tax payments to direct debit with my email only, and pulled a copy of last year's tax receipt to highlight my single signature. On the way home, I stopped at the pharmacy and switched my prescriptions. The tech printed my entire history as requested, and I circled the heart medication with a blue pen and wrote "error" in the margin. Then handed a copy to the pharmacist for their file. Paper leaves a trail. Trails tell true stories when voices lie. Back at the kitchen table, I opened the old bank portal and downloaded every monthly statement, saved them to the USB, then printed the pages with the Dad's Share line highlighted. I wrote totals on a yellow legal pad: $12,400 over the period, $850 last month. Market rate, handwritten in a column the bank did not create. I paused the dad rent adjustment transfer and waited. The text arrived. Need your rent share before EOD. Landlord charges late fees. I stared at the word landlord until it stopped being a joke and became evidence. I answered, "Please send terms," a phrase I chose because he thinks paperwork is his terrain. He sent back the same forged PDF with V2 in the name. I saved it, printed it, and wrote "forged" next to my typed name with a calm hand. I didn't argue the document with him. I filed it under ammo. I called the county clerk and asked whether any refinance inquiries had been made using my parcel number. "Nothing recorded," she said, and I noted her name and the time. I asked about recording a trust once signed. She explained the process, and I asked if a title monitoring alert service existed. "We can't alert, but you can check weekly," she said. I wrote Wednesday's title check in the calendar. I called Klein, the lawyer, and confirmed our Tuesday 0900 signing. "Bring your granddaughter if she's trustee," he said, "and IDs." I wrote IDs X2, then checked my wallet to feel their edges. At noon, Jordan, the realtor, texted comps, 3 brick houses in a 5-block radius, all with closing dates under 45 days. "If you wanted a quick close, it's doable," she wrote. I asked what an earnest money deposit looked like on a 30-day target. She called, answered in specifics, and offered to put a vetted buyer under a soft preliminary if I wished. "Funds in escrow within 24 hours, she said. I did not commit. I asked for the escrow instructions draft and read it 3 times, then placed it under the trust draft in the red folder. At 4:00, my son floated through the kitchen and mentioned splitting utilities as if he were reading from a script we'd always followed. I brewed coffee and said, "Utilities. Yes. Landlord. No." And he laughed like it was banter. He suggested a shared credit card to simplify. And I said, "I'll stay with cash and checks," and turned away to wash a mug that wasn't dirty, because sometimes it helps to keep your hands moving while you refuse bad systems. He asked if I'd seen the new spreadsheet tab. I said, "I printed it." And he looked at the printer like it had betrayed him. I went to the garage, took a photo of the electric meter, and wrote the number down with the date. Later, when he turned on the space heater and the gaming rig in his room, I went into the basement and felt the breaker warming. I wrote the label correctly on the panel with a black marker. The house tells you the truth if you listen. I turned to reputation next. Not the loud kind, but the kind that lives in quiet corrections and official notes. I visited the VA office and asked to speak with Counselor Reyes. We sat in a small room with chairs that didn't scrape. I explained the misrouted mail and the archived messages I hadn't read, and she listened without interrupting. "Let's update everything," she said, and we did. Email to the new address, phone to the prepaid as backup, postal to the P.O. box with confirmation number printed and signed. She logged a note on my file. Mail misdirection suspected. Veteran confirmed no third-party authorization. All changes verified in person with ID. She handed me a printout and told me to keep it with my red folder. "If anyone calls on your behalf, ask for me," she added. I wrote Reyes Ally on my network map and exhaled. I stopped by the police station's front desk and asked to file an information-only report regarding family financial coercion risk. The officer asked if I wished to name my son. I said I wanted a documented paper trail and would provide names if escalation occurred. He took my statement, gave me a case number, and printed the report. "This doesn't assign fault," he said. "It marks time. Mark time saves lives," I answered, and he nodded. I placed the case number in the folder next to the forged PDF, then went home and put water on for tea, because the weight of doing things right sits heavy until you sip something warm and tell your hands they did their job. The neighbor, Mr. Larkin, waved me over as I checked the mail at the P.O. box. "Heard you might be selling," he said. Small talk tone, big eyes. "Assessing," I said. "Market's up." He said my son told folks they're carrying me. And I smiled and said, "I've carried this house since '79, and pulled the deed copy from my folder and let him read the names. He read slowly, nodded, and said, "People like documents." A sentence that had more kindness in it than gossip. "People like documents," I echoed. I asked if his porch camera caught my driveway by accident. "It does," he said. "If you ever need to confirm a time," I wrote Larkin, timestamp capable, on the map. I called my sister in Ohio, the one who hears trouble early and responds with facts. I told her the outline, kept emotion behind the facts, and asked her to hold the documents I emailed in a folder labeled ICE. "You always were the cautious one," she said. "Caution close to truth looks like courage," I answered, and she laughed. She promised that if anyone called her with a creative narrative, she'd ask for the date and the document. "Date and document," she repeated. I printed a one-page house ownership and expense ledger. Title, bullets, totals, names. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a briefing slide in black and white. I placed 3 copies in the folder and slid another into the pocket of the blazer I'd wear on Thanksgiving. I called our church's office and asked the pastor if he'd mind me reserving the small side room Sunday morning. "Private family talk, if needed," I said. He agreed without asking details, and I logged his kindness as another quiet support beam. I texted my granddaughter. "Rehearsal tonight, 7 numbers only." She responded with a check mark. At 7, she sat at the table with a notebook and read the electric usage line, the grocery average, the rent share total, clear as a bell. I timed her. 2 minutes, 30 seconds. "If I ask you to read this at dinner, you can stop at any time," I said. "I won't need to stop," she answered. I pressed a 20 into her hand anyway and told her Lydia would have called it a rehearsal treat. She tucked it into her book without looking. I knew he was floating the "we took him in" line again, because 2 different cousins texted me versions of the same question. "All okay at your place?" I replied with a photo of the deed and the caption, "Title steady since 1979. Not angry, not defensive, just paper. One cousin wrote back a heart. The other sent, "Wow." I asked both to keep Thanksgiving calm and to listen. I didn't ask them to take sides because sides create noise. Proof creates silence. Psychology is pattern and pause. I changed the house's rhythm in ways that don't look like changes. Lights on timers aligned with my steps. Coffee at 6:30 sharp. Front door locked at 2000 every night. No exceptions. I put the old safe in plain sight, ajar, with decoy papers. I left the new safe silent behind sweaters. I set my phone to Do Not Disturb 1 hour earlier than usual, and let his evening texts pile up unread. I placed a sticky note on the fridge that read, "Inspection Saturday 10th, and when he scoffed, I just nodded and wiped the counter. I sat with a small handheld radio in my lap during calls to normalize the static. I remembered last year's hold music mask and decided this time the noise would be mine. When I called Jordan to ask a question about escrow timelines, I turned the radio up for 10 seconds, then back down. If he was listening, he'd hear a pattern without meaning. Better he chase ghosts than documents. I set bait with a spreadsheet. I printed an auto-pay schedule reminder and left it on the desk in the den where he does his budgeting theater. It listed old transfer dates with red X's and new ones blank. He glanced at it, then at me, then said nothing. And the nothing told me he'd be trying to fill those blanks without knowing the accounts moved. I left the old account with a $600 balance and no active bills. An attractive puddle meant to tempt a hurried hand. I told Patel at the credit union to flag any Zelle or Venmo linkage attempts and call me. She wrote, "Call customer," next to my file and underlined it. I recorded a short statement on my prepaid voicemail. Leave your name, the date, and the document you're calling about. Because even machines can demand paper. I plotted the Thanksgiving table like terrain. Plates here. Red folder folded into a neutral gray binder that wouldn't scream evidence. Phone on the table with speaker ready. Realtor contact prepped to answer at a set minute. Neighbor on standby if a timestamp mattered. I printed the deposit receipt template Jordan sent and left the amount line blank. I would fill it after Tuesday's trust signing, contingent on how my stomach felt. I ran a secret chase drill with my granddaughter. Drive to the bank's night drop. Slide a sealed envelope addressed to myself with copies of the forged PDF and the police case number. Stamp it with the time, and return home. "Why mail to yourself?" she asked. "Because postmarks beat arguments," I said. She nodded and didn't ask for drama, only logistics. That's why she would read numbers and not opinions at dinner. He tried to seed fear on Friday. "A buddy's dad got kicked out when the landlord sold the place," he said casually while scrolling his phone. "And they didn't even give him 30 days. I reached for Lydia's mixing bowl, set it on the counter, and poured flour like snow. "I bought this house in '79, I said, "and it's not a rental." He smirked and said, "Market rate for old neighborhoods is wild," I said. "Market rate is for buyers and sellers. Owners read deed language." He made that little noise people make when they want round two. I turned the radio on low and hummed with it while I measured yeast. He walked out. Saturday at 10, Jordan arrived for insurance photos. She wore a blazer, neutral, and took pictures of windows and the backyard fence, measured a room aloud, then shook my hand. As she left, my son asked, "What's the inspection for?" I said, "Insurance likes current pictures." And he said, "You're acting paranoid." And I said, "I'm acting like a homeowner." He held my gaze 3 beats longer than usual, then nodded, then did the thing where he tries to change the subject with a joke. The joke wasn't funny. The refrigerator hummed. My granddaughter stood by the sink and didn't move, pencil resting on her notebook like it might launch a rocket if necessary. Sunday morning. I walked into church, slipped into the side room I'd reserved, and laid out the gray binder. Then closed it again. I asked Pastor to witness a notary signature Tuesday if needed. He said he'd be there at 9. I shook his hand and left, taking nothing but the knowledge that when it was time to sign, a steady pen would be waiting. On the way home, I stopped by the post office and bought a sheet of certified mail stickers, then addressed a letter to my son. Notice of ownership and mail authority. I did not send it. I placed it in the folder under deploy if necessary. Too early, and paperwork looks like provocation. Right on time. It looks like clarity. That afternoon, the prepaid rang. Patel from the credit union. "We blocked an attempt to link your old account to a new payment service," she said, and then a password reset request. I wrote the time, 14:43, and asked if the IP address was local. "Yes," she said. "Same city." "Thank you," I said, and she promised a paper letter would confirm the block. I hung up, turned the radio up for a moment, then off, and walked into the living room. He sat with his laptop open and a crease between his eyebrows. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Everything's good," I said, and sat with my coffee. He closed the laptop too quickly. I set the final triggers Monday night. 2-factor authentication across every utility and service. Verification codes routed to the prepaid. Backup codes printed and sealed in an envelope labeled key inside the red folder. I called Klein to confirm Tuesday's trust signing, and we rehearsed the precise order. Verify IDs, sign trust, notarize vial at the clerk's office. Return to Jordan with the trust name for the preliminary sales contract. Buyer's earnest money deposit hits escrow by Wednesday noon. Title company opens file Wednesday afternoon. He said, "You've run operations." And I said, "Yes." And we ended the call without applause. I sat in the quiet kitchen and let my jaw unclench. A small thought cut through. People confuse calm with weakness until paper shows up. I polished the metals one more time, not for display, but for hands-on memory. The cloth moved in circles. The metal brightened. My breathing matched the motion. I set the keys on the table and moved them in my palm, listening for the thin sound that has become my metronome. The gray binder sat ready at the end of the table where Lydia used to place the rolls. My granddaughter texted a thumbs up and a line. Numbers memorize themselves when they're true. I smiled at the phone and placed it face down with the speaker icon visible. Before bed, I walked the perimeter of the house, finger on the edge of the fence, checking the latch, then stood at the mailbox with the certified letter sticker in my pocket and did not mail it. I looked up the street. Mr. Larkin waved without asking questions. I waved back and went inside. The hallway lamp cast a steady cone of light, and the door clicked once, then twice. I turned the radio off and listened to the house breathe. In the other room, my son's phone pinged. He laughed at something on the screen, then stopped. The silence hung a shade longer than usual. The next move is mine, and it carries no exclamation points, only dates and names and a line I will speak like a clean break. Tuesday came on time. I drove my granddaughter to Klein's office at Orwright 40, parked, and walked in with the folder. We presented IDs, read the trust instrument clause by clause, and signed where the tabs told us to sign. The notary's stamp pressed with a firm clack that sounded like a door locking from the inside. Klein handed me 2 original copies and a set of certified summaries. "File these before lunch," he said. We walked across to the clerk's office. The clerk stamped, time-stamped, scanned, and handed back the receipt with a number that will outlive all of us. I texted Jordan. "Trust name confirmed." She replied, "Prelim contract ready. Buyer prepared. Earnest money in escrow 24. I said, "Stand by for Thursday, confirm." And then we went for coffee, because the body needs small anchors between signatures. On the way home, we stopped at the bank. I placed a sealed envelope into the night drop, even in daylight. Addressed to myself with copies of the forged PDF, the police case number, the clerk's stamp, the trust summary. My granddaughter slid it in, looked at me, and said, "Timestamp done. The postmark will arrive tomorrow. I will not need it, but need and preparation are different questions." At the light on Maple, my phone vibrated. Patel. Escrow verification call came through, all matched. Deposit expected by 11 Wednesday, I said. "Thank you." And she said, "Paper wins," and we hung up. In the passenger seat, my granddaughter read her notebook quietly, lips moving once, numbers arranging themselves in a rhythm I could trust. We pulled into the driveway. My son stood on the porch with a folded piece of paper like a flag he wanted me to salute. "We need to sign this rent agreement," he said, smiling with his teeth, voice a half step too bright. I climbed the stairs with the gray binder in my hand and set it on the table next to Lydia's bowls. "We'll sign something," I said. He looked at the binder like it might bite. He started to talk. Then his phone buzzed. He looked down and his face shifted. He put the paper on the table. "We'll talk at dinner," he said. "We will," I answered. He walked away. Slower than usual, I stood in the silence and let my breath settle. The radio sat quiet on the counter. The clock ticked. Jordan's name sat second on my call list, ready to join on speaker when I pressed it. The deposit receipt template had a blank line, waiting for a number that would turn theory into gravity. The trust paper in my pocket felt like a small shield. The house held still like it knew a different owner voice had returned. I touched the keys once. Thanksgiving is 3 days away. The board is set. I will not raise my voice. I will read dates and hold paper, and when the toast lifts, I will end the ledger with the only line that ever mattered. Wednesday at 10:47. Mal. My prepaid buzzed once, with Patel's voice calm, as a metronome confirming the buyer's earnest money had posted to escrow. Receipt number ending in 2197, and before I could write the last digit, she added that someone had tried to add an external transfer from my old account at 1031, and the system declined it with a lockout. I wrote both times and the decline code on the yellow pad, circled them, and slid the slip into the gray binder. A new variable. I checked the porch. Quiet street. Larkin's dog asleep against the fence. Inside, my son's door stood open. Laptop glow visible. A message bubble flashing on his screen that I couldn't read, but could recognize as urgent by the way his jaw set. He wandered into the kitchen, asked if the market news was good. And I said markets are good for people who read their contracts. He smiled with too many teeth and said cousins were excited for Thursday. Glad we can all be together under the same roof. And I stirred sugar into my coffee so I wouldn't answer the bait. The escrow confirmation email pinged. I printed it and placed the receipt under the deed like a stack of coordinates aligning. At 1:18, the family group chat lit with his message titled Dad Support Plan, full of phrases that tried to sound gentle but marched. Shared costs, joint decisions, a formal rent so it's fair, and a line about cognitive lapses that made my granddaughter send me a separate text. I've got you. He followed with, Pastor offered to mediate if needed, which was creative because I was the one who'd reserved the side room. I called the doctor's office and asked for a same-day note confirming last month's cognitive screen. Clear and routine. The nurse printed it with today's date, signed, and left it at the front desk. I drove over, picked it up, and tucked it behind the trust summary, back home. I placed Lydia's mixing bowls on the counter and set the recipe card for rolls at the angle she liked. A small ceremony that steadied me more than any speech would. He came in, saw the card, and said, We'll make extra. People are hungry this year. And I nodded and thought hunger looks different depending on what you've trained your appetite to be. At 3:40, he brought in an acquaintance with a clipboard who introduced himself as Helping Families Structure Contributions, a title with no badge and too many syllables. I offered coffee in the side room I'd reserved at church, said the lighting was better there, and we walked 2 blocks in a neat line. My granddaughter beside me, his friend behind, inside. I set the gray binder on the table and opened to the page with the deed, the trust summary, the escrow receipt, and my doctor's letter. The clipboard man started saying, So legally, and I slid the police information-only report across the table. Case number, large enough to be read without leaning. He looked at the numbers and cleared his throat. My son tried to smile, like this was still a friendly brainstorm. I said, If you're licensed, leave a card. Otherwise, enjoy the coffee. And he stared at his clipboard, as if it had just gained weight. He left his mug half full and walked out. Humor nudged the edge of the room. My granddaughter whispered, Clipboard's heavy when it's empty. And I couldn't help a small breath that might have been a laugh if we weren't doing surgery. At 5:12, my prepaid buzzed with an alert. An attempt to transfer $950 from the old account via a linked app. Denied. Then a second alert. Password reset, requested, and blocked. I stepped into the living room, where he sat with his phone angled behind his knee like a teenager. On his screen, the word declined painted itself twice, like a stubborn watermark. He lifted his head, smiled, said he was checking sports, and I nodded. Went to the breaker box, ran my knuckles along the labels I'd rewritten, and let the feeling pass without argument. Upstairs, I wrote the 2 new times on the pad, photographed the screen from the hallway reflection, a trick you learn when camera angles matter, and placed the printout next to the forged Dad Agreement V2 PDF. Larkin texted a thumbs-up emoji without words. His porch camera had my driveway at both times if anyone wanted to argue geography later. The guilt barrage arrived at 7:03 in 3 quick messages. We're a team. Late fees hurt us both. It's really just respect under one roof. I brewed tea and turned the handheld radio to a low murmur. Not enough to annoy. Just enough to cover the new edge in my breathing. He tried humor. Sent a meme about boomer budgets. Then shifted to, You've always said fairness matters. A sentence that usually hooks something inside me. I placed the meme under the escrow receipt and wrote, Script pivot on the margin. Objective unchanged. I set the oven to proof the dough, reset my timer, and taped a small note inside the pantry door. Thursday for Getkor. Flashpoint. Then closed the door and walked away, like a man who likes neat pantries and nothing else. Thursday morning. The house woke into a rhythm improved by routine. The dough rose. The turkey took its place. My granddaughter arrived with a notebook and a quiet face that said she had rehearsed without turning into stone. Cousins trickled in, trays in hand. Voices light at first. My son hovered at the island making fast jokes about this economy, adding garnish to plates he didn't cook. His shoulders wide because you can inflate shoulders when you think a crowd is yours. I moved through the kitchen like I've moved through staging tents in deserts. Small circles, clean edges. Never bump the men carrying hot metal. At 3:40, I slid the gray binder into the middle of the table, under a folded dish towel that looked like it belonged there. I felt the keys in my pocket and let them jingle once, just enough to hear the sound I've been teaching myself to listen for. Larkin's text arrived, porch cam on, and I replied with a single dot. At 3:58, he lifted his glass and tapped it gently with a fork, announced gratitude, and began the line he's been practicing. We took Dad in when he needed us. I unfolded the towel, placed the binder open in front of my plate, and nodded for my granddaughter to start. She read the numbers like poetry. 12,400 labeled Dad's share. 850 last month. Electric spikes aligned with weekends. Grocery averages. Property tax split despite title. She stopped at 2 minutes 30, as rehearsed, looked up, and closed her notebook. Cousins stared at the pages as if print could change temperature. I pressed speaker on my phone and tapped Jordan's name. She answered on the first ring, her voice clear, and confirmed the escrow deposit reference, 2197. Buyer funds in place. Preliminary contract ready under the trust name. Closing timeline 30 days upon signature. I thanked her and ended the call. He laughed too loud, said, "This is dramatic," and his voice hitched on the second syllable. I saw two cousins glance at the deed, then at him, then at me. Public opinion turns when paper replaces rumor. I pointed to the doctor's note that said, "Cognitive screening normal." He squinted at it like it should blur if he frowned hard enough. He tried one last pivot, mid-toast. His thumbs moved under the table, and a fresh text appeared on my prepaid's lock screen from the old payment app. Another transfer attempt flagged and declined at 407 Puagawaniswem. The room wasn't watching his thumbs. The room was watching my binder. He stood, held up his phone like a prop, said, "We can settle this later. Dinner's getting cold." And I lifted my finger and tapped the red folder to settle the only thing that mattered. "We're settling it now," I said. Voice steady, hands still. He sat, grinned at a cousin like this was a reality show, and said I was making a big deal out of household math. My granddaughter set Lydia's rolls on the table and whispered, "They're perfect." And for a beat, the room smelled like butter and flour, and somebody chuckled when the turkey came out a little dry, because Lydia used to say, "Dry turkey means the stories went long." Not wrong. A pinch of humor keeps the room human. I let the training carry me. 3-breath cadence. Inhale through the nose. Exhale through the nose. Say less than you prepared. Stick to the document. Let them read their own reactions. I pictured the PACE plan I'd taught young sergeants. Primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, and saw how each layer had already held. Primary, trust signed and escrow posted. Alternate, police information report and VA notes. Contingency, safe deposit box and P or O. Box. Emergency, neighbor's camera, pastor's room, my sister's ice folder out of state. I remembered teaching comms blackout drills and how the quiet makes careless men louder. He started stacking forks to make noise. I moved the stack aside with a flat palm and an even face. He used the word misunderstanding 3 times. Pattern confirmed. The perfect storm arrived in sequence, not spectacle. The doorbell rang with a courier holding the certified letter I'd mailed to myself. Postmarked Wednesday, countersigned today, proving chain of custody for the forged PDF and the case number. I took it, signed, and placed the envelope on the table unopened like a promise. My prepaid buzzed with a voicemail from Reyes at the VA, confirming all mail and portal access had been restored solely to me, recorded with the tagline they use for official calls. Larkin texted a still from his porch cam, showing our front door at 4:05, with my son's friend approaching, then leaving when he saw the room filled. I didn't need it, but I had it. Jordan texted, "Buyer reconfirmed. Funds cleared twice." Pastor sent a thumbs up without words. My sister wrote, "Standing by," and nothing else. The house, the block, the agencies, the bank. Each tool clicked into place like a bolt sliding home. He felt it too. His face did that flattening thing men do when the map they've drawn doesn't match the terrain under their shoes. He flicked to defense, claimed he'd overcharged only to save for my care, gestured vaguely toward a jar on a shelf with loose bills and movie ticket stubs I hadn't noticed because jars collect stories, not money. I asked for receipts. He said, "It's not that literal." I pointed to the rent ledger total and the months with doctor visits that coincidentally aligned with rent hikes. He said, "You know how anxiety works," I said. "I know how budgets work." He tried to float a line about the market forcing decisions. I tapped the deed, the trust, the escrow receipt, and said, "Markets don't own this table." His voice thinned, then sharpened, then reached for volume. I lifted my hand once and let silence push the volume back down. Lydia used to do that when teenagers got loud. The room remembered. Emotion tried to climb my throat and got redirected into motion. I poured water from the clear pitcher she loved, watched it steady into a glass, and set the glass in front of him like he was still my son, and not a problem to be solved. He took it. Didn't drink. I thought of the little boy who carried screws to the garage to fix a radio he'd broken, and the young man who called me at midnight from a parking lot when a tire blew, and he didn't want to wake his friends. I saw that fear again, grown now into a habit of control, clothed in jokes that bought him silence. Grief moved through my ribs, not as a sentence, but as a reminder to calibrate my strength. This wasn't about crushing him. It was about ending a practice that ate the spine of our home. I looked at his face and said, softly, "We're done paying rent in this house." And my granddaughter exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath since June. He went for a last wild swing, muttered about calling a landlord he knows, said something about waved his phone like it could make laws. I slid the police case number across the table and placed the county clerk's stamped trust filing above it, then turned over the certified envelope from my own letter and showed the postmark like a small, honest star. "Call who you like," I said, quiet. "Ask for their date and their document." The cousins didn't move. Someone's fork slid and clinked against a plate, in the clipped silence. It sounded like a gavel. He looked at each person, searching for the old script, and found paper instead of nods. Public opinion didn't flip with cheers. It shifted the way a house settles when you fix the joist. Small sounds, new balance. I tasted the bitter and let it pass. I folded Lydia's towel, placed it beside the rolls, and kept my voice. Tactical thought. Offer no extra words. Offer one clear path. "We'll outline next steps after dessert," I said, with dates attached. He scoffed, but the edge had dulled, because edges dull when they meet powered tools and don't cut. He dropped his eyes to his phone. Another declined, flashed, and vanished. Not because I chased his screen, but because the room made secrets disobedient. I let the moment hang, then stood and lifted a piece of turkey with the carving fork like a flag. No one had to salute. "Eat while it's warm," I said, and a few people laughed because reality always needs a fork. Under the table, my hand found the keys and moved them once, the soft jingle that's become my way of reminding myself where the exits are and how to leave if leaving because the movement, misread it as nervousness, and smiled, which told me he was still playing checkers in a room that had turned to chess 3 days ago. My granddaughter leaned in and said, "Do you want me to read the bank times again?" And I shook my head. Repetition isn't persuasion, it's noise. We ate. The cranberry sauce stained the white plate the way time stains clean stories. Larkin texted, "All quiet out here." Rhea's voicemail icon kept glowing like a small lighthouse. Patel's confirmation sat under my palm with the deposit numbers steady as coordinates. I cleared my plate, stacked the dishes with the muscle memory of 1,000 dinners that ended in laughter and small messes, and let my mind do its own after-action report in lines no one could hear. Trigger matched, chain of custody intact, allies in place, opponent's tactics logged, defenses holding. I wiped the counter, rinsed a pan, leaned the towel over the sink, turned the radio off. The room shifted into the part of gatherings where people think stories have finished when actually the final scene is about to start. He checked his watch for theater. I checked my calendar for timing. I lifted the gray binder and felt the weight of it settle against my palm, like a tool that knows its job. I set the binder back down and looked at my family, one by one, long enough for each to know they had been seen in the room where years were spent and repaired. Then I looked at my son, the man who used my silence as currency and mistook it for a blank check. He opened his mouth, maybe for another joke, maybe for a last attempt to pivot into sentiment. I tapped the red folder once with my index finger, steady as a drumbeat, and watched the room lean forward without moving their chairs. We were exactly on the minute I had marked inside the pantry. "We finish now," I said, and the sound of it was not loud, and not soft. It was final. I didn't raise my voice. I slid the gray binder into the center of the table, turned the deed and the trust page so the names faced the room, placed the escrow receipt on top like a compass, and laid one more document over them all, a letter I'd prepared and sent to myself for chain of custody, now opened, stamped, and signed. Notice of revocation of financial authority and termination of informal arrangements. Effective today. Witnessed by the people eating Lydia's rolls. I set a spare envelope beside my son's plate with his name on it, the kind you feel in your fingers before you feel it in your chest, and said, "Read after dessert." He watched my hands like they might shake. They didn't. I reminded everyone of the case number from the police information report and the VA note that logs me as the only authorized voice on my benefits. I turned my phone face and said, "Dates and documents, not moods and memories." The room inhaled, then held. He tried the easy pivot first, a smile with a flinch under it, called this a misunderstanding between men who love each other, said I'd gotten spooked by paperwork, and reached for the envelope. I tapped the binder, not his hand, and told him the envelope was his after we finished our meal like civilized people, because Lydia would have insisted on plates cleared and counters wiped before any argument got to wear boots. He said, "We took you in again," with the voice he uses when he wants cousins to nod. And one cousin looked at the deed, and then at the floor. I opened the red folder, slid out a one-page ledger summary, listed my pension, disability, Social Security, the 18 months of Dad's share, the property tax split that shouldn't have been split, and I read the totals without tone. He tried to laugh. It caught in his throat. I told him we were discontinuing all shared finances immediately, that utilities and taxes would route through my new accounts, and that no one would be collecting rent from me in a house I bought in 1979. A new variable, I thought. He felt it land. The systems started answering for me. Patel's scheduled call hit at the minute we'd agreed upon. Her voice crisp on speaker confirming the escrow deposit verified twice, and a third-party transfer attempt at 407 p. Ma'am. Declined under the lock I'd placed yesterday. Incident logged. I thanked her and ended the call. A voicemail icon blinked. Reyes at the VA left a recorded message. All mail and portal access restored solely to Mr. Hale. Note added. Veteran reports prior misdirection. Any third-party contact to be escalated to counselor. Larkin knocked once, handed me a printed still from his porch camera with today's timestamp, that showed the clipboard friend lingering and leaving. Evidence arrived like weather fronts. You can say you don't like the rain. You still get wet. My son stared at the printed still without touching it. He saw more than a face at the edge of the frame. He saw the end of improvisation. He switched from swagger to pleading in one stumbled sentence. Said he only overcharged to build a care fund, pointed at a glass jar with a handful of ones and some old movie stubs sitting on the bookshelf like a prop, and asked me to slow this down. He said "Dad" 3 times in a row, softer each time, and the third one sounded like the boy who called me from a parking lot years ago when a tire went and pride failed him, and I had to place my palm flat on the table and breathe once to keep my voice level. He said he was scared of losing the roof and that he'd kept this place alive for both of us, and I heard the sentence he couldn't say. He was scared of losing control. I took the jar off the shelf, set it on the table between us, opened the lid, and poured the bills and stubs out, counted what there was, $18, and slid the movie tickets back to him. "This jar is not a ledger," I said. "This jar is a story. The ledger is in the folder. Ledger." He swallowed and looked at the counters like they might offer him a script. They didn't. I gave him a path instead of a target. I took another envelope from the red folder and slid it across. 3 printed pages that outlined a first month's deposit and 2 months' rent for a modest apartment, paid directly to the landlord upon signed lease, a list of 3 property managers with open units, and a mover shortlist if he wanted help packing, all contingent on a few clear actions: return all keys by Sunday at 1800, remove personal items within 14 days, stop presenting himself as landlord to me or anyone else, cease any attempts to access my accounts or mail, confirm in writing that all my portal passwords and devices are removed from his reach, and agree to a quiet hour to retrieve anything sentimental after move-out if he needed it. I kept the page clear of moral commentary and heavy with dates. "It's grace, not surrender," I said. "Offer expires in 10 days. Your signature activates it." He stared at the amount allocated, 3 months total, and tested the edges for loopholes. There weren't any. He slid the envelope back an inch, then forward again, then stopped touching it, which told me he was close to taking it. He tried to bargain instead, asked for half the sale if the house was already on the block, claimed sweat equity for errands and favors, called back to the new water heater and the tune-up for the furnace, and the grocery runs he texts about as if pictures of canned tomatoes are deeds of trust. I didn't argue the word equity. I read numbers. I listed the mortgage paid off years ago solely by my income and Lydia's, the taxes I covered when his shares appeared, the maintenance records with my initials, the 2 decades where the only hands on the gutters were mine, and the past 18 months where my money wore his labels. My granddaughter added a sentence without lifting her eyes from the notebook. "Dad, the spikes line up with your parties." He flinched and said nothing. A cousin reached for cranberry sauce and made a show of chewing to cover the tension, and I loved him for that small assist. "This isn't a courtroom," I said, "and I'm not a judge. I'm the owner. We're setting terms." He pivoted into memory, like men do when math fails them. Said Mom wouldn't want this. Said she believed in family pooling money. Said the holiday was the wrong time for legalese. I picked up Lydia's mixing bowl and wiped a flower ring with the dish towel she embroidered, crooked on purpose. And I said, "Your mother believed in gratitude without invoices." I set the bowl down, and we both looked at the shadow it cast on the table like the ghost of every dinner she saved by laughing. "We honor her by telling the Bill's truth," I added. He tried to summon the pastor as a surprise mediator. I told him I'd already booked the side room for tomorrow at 10 OI, and we could sit there with pastor and sign the support package if he chose, or, alternatively, read the timeline that follows from refusal. He blinked fast. The room loosened a notch at the word tomorrow. We had filled tonight with enough. I gathered the plates because motion keeps a man from leaking grief onto paper. I stacked them, rinsed them, handed a towel to my granddaughter, watched a cousin scrape casseroles into containers, and let the house rehearse being a home without an argument clogging its vents. Then I turned back to the table and taught the only lesson I wanted to teach, not with a speech, but with a few sentences weighted with practice. Gratitude is a practice, not a bill, I said. If you help a man, you don't invoice him later with interest. If you need help, you ask with a date and a plan. If you disagree, you bring the document and the line item, not the volume or the shame. From now on, anything about me runs on that schedule. Date and document. I pointed to the phrase in my notebook I'd written at 5 in the morning. Boundaries enacted through procedure. I didn't read it aloud. I lived it, sliding the envelope back to his side one more time and tapping the signature line with a knuckle. He stared at the signature line like it was a cliff he hadn't trained for, glanced at the cousins for rescue, found none, looked back at me, landed on pride, and whispered he needed time to think. I nodded and wrote, "Deadline 10 days" on the top, thinking lives inside calendars. Now. I stood, walked to the hall closet, pulled the zip bag with the old lock cylinder, and set it on the table. "Tonight, after everyone leaves, we change this," I said, not as a threat, but as a maintenance note. "You're here through Sunday as a guest. After that, call before you come." He didn't like the word guest. He didn't deny it either. He reached for his phone to trigger a last transfer and flinched when the app refused him one more time. Declined. Mistake. Noted. I handed him the sealed envelope with his name on it, the one I'd told him to open after dessert. He tore it at the edge, read the first line. Notice to cease rent collection. No landlord relationship exists. Owner, Robert Hale. And sputtered something about, "You wouldn't actually mail this." I tapped the certified stamp in the corner. "I already did," I said. He set the paper down like it might burn. Justice doesn't need an audience. It needs a process. I walked to the entry table, took a small ceramic dish where Lydia kept spare keys for guests, and set it by his elbow. "Keys go here by Sunday, 6 p.m., I said. "If you need more time to pack, we schedule it, not improvise it." He nodded without realizing he'd nodded. Cousins breathed again. My granddaughter wrote the time and place in her notebook as if minutes mattered, because now they did. The cascade started slow and picked up like a solid rain. I texted Jordan a single word, "confirm," and she replied with the calendar invite for Monday's final photos and the title company's file number. I logged into utilities and detached his email from notifications, set two-factor to my prepaid, printed confirmation pages, and slid them into the folder. I walked to the garage, flipped open the breaker box, and wrote the correct labels with a black marker, handed him a copy of the emergency shutoff sheet like I would hand any adult a safety brief. I snapped a photo of the old cylinder, then took the new one from the bag and set it by the screwdriver on the counter. He watched me and said nothing. You do not argue with a man replacing the lock on his own door when his name is on the title twice. In the evening, when the house emptied and only 3 plates sat in the sink, he tried one more angle, a raw mix of shame and calculation. He said moving would ruin him, that he couldn't handle rent, that he had nowhere, and if I went through with this, I'd be leaving him on the street. I handed him a printed page from the support on tabs, and a printed bus schedule highlighted between here and the nearest complex. "You won't be on the street," I said. "You'll be in an apartment you can afford if you turn off the heaters on all night and stop feeding 10 grown men from my pantry." He folded the page once, twice, then unfolded it. He asked if I'd wire him the moving money. "I'll pay the landlord directly upon signed lease, no cash to you. That's what got us here." He swallowed the sentence he wanted to use and put the page in his back pocket. I sent the cousins home with foil-covered plates and a request. No phone trees, no sides, no speeches online. "If anyone asks, tell them the homeowner handled the paperwork," I said, and they nodded, grateful to be given a clean line to carry into their own kitchens. My granddaughter stayed, held the flashlight while I swapped the lock cylinder, handed me the screws in order without being asked. We tested the key twice, felt the clean click, and she said, "That sound is relief," I said. "That sound is a boundary." And she smiled the way Lydia used to when I got a word right after circling it for days. We wiped the counters, checked the windows, turned off the radio, and stood in the doorway for a breath, listening to the house learn the new cadence. The floorboards made the same old noises. The air felt lighter anyway. I slept in 2-hour blocks, not because fear sat on my chest, but because my body remembered overnight watches and wanted to do them one more time for a better reason. At 02:11, the phone lit with a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, and in the morning heard my son's voice trying a slurry of apology and blame. He said he'd sign, then said he'd sue, then said he'd never speak to me again, then said he'd see me at 10 with the pastor. "Bring a pen," I said to no one in the dark, and watched the recording bar hit the end. At 06:30, I brewed coffee and polished the metals because they keep my hands honest. Then placed the support envelope on the counter, added a second copy for him to take to a friend if he wanted advice that didn't involve a clipboard. A new day. Same map. I wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. We met Pastor in the side room. 3 chairs and a window that let in enough light to make lying uncomfortable. I laid the support packet and the notice to cease rent collection flat, kept the police case number card visible but not waved. My son read silently, lips moving over numbers like they were new words. Pastor asked him to summarize what he understood. He said, "He's selling the house to spite me." And Pastor tilted his head and said, "Read the trust name aloud." He read our granddaughter's name and my own, stumbled on the word trustee, paused, and the pause did more work than any sermon. "This isn't spite," Pastor said gently. "This is stewardship," I added, "and procedure." He signed the support packet. Pastor witnessed. The pen scratched. The room exhaled. I drove straight from church to the clerk's office and filed a copy of the support agreement under the case number for my own neatness. Then to the bank to print final confirmation letters on letterhead for the credit freezes and the account locks. Patel initialed the margins for me the way she does now. A small kindness. I stopped at the post office and mailed certified copies to my sister's ICE folder, a ritual that calms me more than any prayer I know. Jordan texted a reminder for Monday's photos and asked if I wanted to entertain a backup buyer. I said, "Proceed as planned," because flipping plans for sport is the old rhythm, and I am building a better one. Back home, I placed Lydia's bowls in there and ran a finger along the green thread towel, then taped a new note inside the pantry door. Sunday, 1800, keys. I clicked my pen closed and slid it into my pocket beside the keys. At 2:03, the phone may ring again. It can ring to voicemail. The paper will answer in the morning. Sunday at 5:58 p.m. I set the ceramic dish by the door and stood where Lydia used to remind everyone to check their pockets. At 6:01, he placed his keys in the dish without looking at me. 4 pieces of metal that had been too loud the last year, and now were quiet. I logged the time on a sticky note and slid it into the gray binder, then handed him a printed move-out checklist with dates and boxes to tick. He asked if I wanted help carrying donations. I said I had a mover scheduled for Tuesday and a church pickup Wednesday, and I pointed to the pile already sorted. Extra chairs, the old rug, 3 boxes of mismatched mugs. He picked up one time he crossed that threshold without an appointment. At 8, I changed the deadbolt again, not because I had to, but because the clean click resets the house's story. I set the new keys on the counter, turned off the hallway lamp, and slept until my alarm without the old habit of listening for someone else's footsteps. Monday photos finished in an hour. Jordan's team moved like a crew that had done this 100 times. Blinds tilted. I followed them with a clipboard and checked rooms against the inventory. By noon, the title company's file number pinged my phone. By 4, the closing date set itself on my calendar 30 days out. 10 RBI Kaga. Ma'am. Conference room B, Bring ID. I packed 1 box a day. Medals and Lydia's bowls first, then recipe cards, then the yellow legal pads, full of dates. I told the buyer I'd leave the workbench and the pegboard hooks, because useful tools should stay with walls that know them. I took the radio, the gray binder, and the red folder. On the final walkthrough, I put my palm on the kitchen door frame and counted to 5, like I did with doorways in tents overseas, when the map changed and the next map started. I locked the door, handed the keys to my granddaughter, now trustee, and we took a photo on the porch without performance. Her hand on my shoulder was steady. The house looked like a place, not a story I had to protect. I moved into a second-floor 1-bedroom across town, with a view of a stand of maples and a bus stop I can hear, but not see. The lease sat clean in a manila I set the kitchen first. Coffee at 2 o'clock, pen at 11, bowls on the second shelf where I can reach them without climbing. I labeled the breaker box with a Sharpie and taped the emergency numbers inside the door. The manager laughed and said I was the first tenant to ask for the main shutoff valve, and then thanked me for letting her know it needed a new label. I set a small rug by the door and wrote, "No shoes after 2000, on a sticky, because rituals keep a place gentle. I joined a VSO group that meets on Thursdays at 7. I gave my name and rank once, then asked the man next to me if he wanted coffee. I filled out a volunteer form at the library and took the Tuesday morning slot shelving returns. I bought a used bike with good and back to check the time. I started a ledger labeled Calm, 1 line per day. Nothing fancy. Wake time, 3 tasks, 1 call, 1 walk. It reads like a map I can follow even when the weather turns. Closing day arrived with no speeches. I signed. The buyer signed. The title agent repeated the number on the wire twice and slid me a receipt. I folded it, placed it in the binder, and drove to the credit union. Patel shook my hand, asked about the move, and printed confirmations for the transfer into the trust account and the portion I kept for myself. I took a cashier's check sized for the next 6 months of living and wrote the memo routine in blue ink so my hand would remember the word every time I opened the envelope. Back at the apartment, I set the binder on the shelf, rolled dough for rolls, and called my granddaughter to test the oven. The rolls came out a little crooked, which made both of us laugh, and that sound felt like the first real victory. He adjusted to his own apartment with the kind of resistance that burns calories, but not logic. Pastor helped him find a place 15 minutes away with a month-to-month lease. The trust sent the stipulated 3-month support directly to his landlord. The receipt landed in my folder. The date hit the calendar. He tried an old move once, asked for a bridge in cash just this week, and I sent the template reply, date and document. He didn't send either, and dropped it. He signed up for a budgeting class the church offered and texted my granddaughter a photo of a workbook page with the words needs versus wants underlined twice. She forwarded it to me with no comment. Small evidence stacks quietly. 2 of his friends who used to eat at my table stopped calling when the pantry closed. One offered to help him move. I sent a thank you note. The man wrote back, "Solid lines make better neighbors." The clipboard acquaintance never came back. A lender mailed him a denial letter for a credit line. He texted me a photo of it with, "Yes, I won't be refinancing anyone's house." I let the joke fall where it deserved. Systems answer better than fathers do. He tested the edge once in the wrong direction, tried to log into my old email out of habit, or out of hunger for the old pattern. The attempt triggered a security note to my prepaid and an in-person verification request at the branch. Patel's initials on the line felt like a lock sliding home. I didn't call him about it. I filed the notice and circled the date. He mentioned it later at church in a sentence that wanted to be a shrug, but came out a small apology. "I'm breaking habits," he said. "Me too," I said. And we left it there because men say more with actions than with extra words once a schedule exists. We rebuilt a communication rhythm, slowly. 1 coffee each week. Calendar invites sent. Location alternating between his side of town and mine. Capped at 40 minutes. No money talk unless it lived on paper. I showed up with a pen and a small index card. He showed up on time. First week we talked about the bike and a scrape he got moving a couch. Second week I asked about his classes. He said he learned that subscriptions eat budgets. He canceled 2 and kept 1. Told me why. Third week I brought him a cheap set of screwdrivers because his landlord doesn't fix small things, and a tenant with a screwdriver saves himself a call. I wrote the box. We agreed to one family dinner a month at my granddaughter's. Potluck. Phones in a bowl. A timer set for the part where news tries to become argument. He returned 2 items he'd forgotten to hand over. One was the remote to the old fan in the garage. The other, a folder of insurance mail from last year. I filed the mail and gave the remote to the buyer with a note. I asked him to sign a short letter acknowledging he had no claim on the house or proceeds. He read it, asked one question, and signed. The pen scratch didn't hurt either of us. It might have even helped. Memorial Day came, and didn't pick a fight with me this year. I put on the jacket that still fits, pinned the medals that still shine because I keep them that way, and rode the bike to the morning ceremony. He asked if he could come. I said yes, and we agreed to meet at the flagpole and stand without speeches. The band hit the first note, and he flinched like the sound could unmake him. I kept my hands at my sides and stared at the names. After. He said he was hungry. We walked to a diner and ordered pancakes and eggs, and he didn't reach at a paragraph. Progress hides in what doesn't happen. There was a slip on a hot Thursday night. A midnight text came in. Emergency. Can you spot me rent? And it hit my screen like an old ghost. I stared at it, counted 10, replied with the rule, date and document, and put the phone face down. At 9:07 the next morning, he sent a screenshot of a minor car repair bill and a note that he'd already negotiated a payment plan. I sent back, good work. He solved it without me. I filed nothing that day and let that be the record. I kept my own rituals sharp because stability is not a trophy. It's maintenance. Tuesday shelves at the library. Thursday VSO group. Saturday morning rolls. Sunday call to my sister where we talk about weather and stories that don't need fixing. I set my apartment like a small base. 2 flashlights by the door. Copies of the trust summary in the safe. Index cards in the drawer labeled "What to say" when someone tries to move a fence. I kept the phrase that saved me at the top of the first card, because it keeps working. Date and document. I looked up at the maples out my window each morning and could tell by their leaves what wind came in overnight. I rode the bike farther each week. I learned the new city rhythms by the way the bus brakes hissed at the corner. People ask what the lesson is, as if you can pour a year into a jar and label it for a shelf. I write it as a checklist instead. When someone uses gratitude as a receipt, write the date they started and the amounts they ask for and the names they use to disguise the bill. When someone says, "We took you in about a house you built," put the deed on the table and invite them to read the names. When someone says, "It's just rent," quiet the room with paper and ask whose signature authorizes a landlord who lives off stories. When someone slides a forged agreement into your night, route your mail, change your locks, freeze your credit, hire a lawyer, sign the trust, and let the escrow receipt do the talking. If you love them, set a timeline that doesn't include your spine as a bridge. If they ask for help, make the help transactional and finite and routed through offices that send receipts. If they choose distance, let distance be the consequence, not the punishment. I learned that boundaries become believable when they make a sound. The sound is a stamp, a lock, a pen, a key in a dish at 6:01 p.m. A phone set face down while a transfer request fails to clear. A drawer closing on a ledger kept in plain sight. I learned that love without procedure invites predators who speak in family proverbs. I learned that my granddaughter can read numbers like a lighthouse reads weather, and that a steady 17-year-old voice can hold a room better than a dozen raised adult voices if the page in her hand is true. I learned that grief shrinks when your hands are busy polishing metals, and your feet keep the old roots, and that Lydia's crooked green thread towel can still teach a man 30 years later how to be precise without becoming hard. Some nights, I pull the gray binder off the shelf and flip to the page where the escrow receipt sits under the deed. I don't hold it like a trophy. I hold it like a wrench, the kind you put back clean because you'll need it again. I keep the red folder thinner now. It has new contents: the lease, the VSO meeting schedule, the volunteer calendar, a letter to my granddaughter that opens the trust if I'm not there someday to sign. I wrote one more index card and slid it behind that letter. It says only one sentence. It's the line I said at the table, and the line that ended the ledger, and the line I hear when I lock the door at night, and the building sighs, and the maples quiet down. I will not pay rent in my own house again. The boy who became a man across from me is learning the difference between care and control. I am learning the same, from my side. We meet for coffee. We swap simple stories. We end on time. He brings a small plant for my window and asks if it needs full sun. I show him where the light falls in the late afternoon and tell him to rotate the pot every few days without asking for anything else. I wash the mug, set it on the rack, and write one line in the ledger. Kept the boundary. Plant turned toward light. Duty endures, but self-care liberates.